给过什么 fun fact 的时候你拿得到？
我的 top 我可以这样说 cool right 我的名字是朱凯俊，今年21岁，我喜欢唱歌。
Yente Rajas ng Handbook of Asian ng NTU Medical Engineering. Yeah.
Nama saya Alisha. Saya dari NTU. Saya belajar kat NTU. Umur saya 22. Saya belajar chemistry. Betul.
So we'll be asking you to name the objects and then we're gonna say them in your mother tongue.
Singaporean. It means chicken. Yes.
In Malay it is ayam.
Hey!
Yeah, it's correct. I still know my use.
Loya. I don't know.
还是有点
Run. Can you rate your proficiency in your mother tongue?
a solid 2. I can't sustain a conversation well.
Okay, I think it will be a 6. Because I think I can understand the language, but I can't really speak it very well.
4, like a 4. I think it's really terrible. I can speak conversational. Because of these words, I don't think I will ever integrate them into my conversation. Like I would say I'm going to see a Paguam. I will never see that in my conversation.
This situation isn't unusual. Many young Singaporeans today are not competent in their own mother tongues and opt to align themselves with English as their first language instead. So much so that some studies have suggested that English is the mother tongue of Singapore today. This is a result of language shift, which was set in motion by the government's language planning policy since the country's post-war independence when English was declared the lingua franca and other languages, Mandarin, Malay and Tamil, were declared as the ethnic mother tongues. Hi, I'm Kilena and today we're talking about language shift. Language shift is the domination of one language over another that leads to progressively fewer children acquiring the minority language as their first language in the home. It happens on two fronts: the societal level, where speakers favor one language over another in everyday situations, and the family level, where younger members of the family speak a different language, usually the more dominant one, from their elders, usually their grandparents in a multilingual society.
Definitely, schools play an important role in making this my first language because that's the mode of delivery for the classes.
As of now, yes. Because it's a universal language, like everybody can speak English, so if you want like effective communication, yes, it is English.
English is the most important language, especially because it's the language that I was raised out already 10. It's the language that converse to everyone in my family. Even my family speaks in English.
Language shift is anchored by the concept of ethnolinguistic vitality, or EV, which is a group's ability to maintain and protect its existence in time as a collective entity with a distinctive identity and language. In Singapore, the language that would have the highest EV is English. English receives a lot of institutional support. It is the language used in the courts, government, industries, and more importantly, education. Singaporeans today are immersed in an English-speaking environment from preschool to university, and will continue using it throughout their careers. English is in fact the only language, save for rare occasions, that remain unchanged throughout their education. Next, English is associated with its speaker's socio-economic status, or SES. SES is usually defined as one's social standing derived from a combination of one's education level, income, and occupation. For example, one 2010 study found that English-speaking families tend to have a higher SES than Chinese-speaking Chinese Singaporeans. We'll get more on that later. English was also chosen as the lingua franca by former Prime Minister Kuan because of its neutrality amongst the ethnic groups in Singapore. However, that decision might not have been that neutral. Since the 1950s, the English educated have had access to higher social mobility upon graduation, while prospects were bleak for those taught in vernacular. This benefited the English educated like PM Lee, who were high in the SES and were the elite. Therefore, one can say that the association with English with high SES harkens back to Singapore's early days of independence. Lastly, English is the most common home language spoken, and its use increased from 2010 to 2015, and is projected only to rise. These factors have influenced Singaporeans of all ethnic groups to shift towards English. The one unifying reason? Power, specifically SES. The language shift to English in Singapore is mostly motivated by socio-economic status.
I never really saw a need to learn Tamil. I mean, except conversing with family, of course.
English guys recommend elite school, then I'm the guy who speaks entirely Malay, is probably from like a neighborhood school.
In my case, I'm a Singaporean Chinese who learns Chinese for the sake of it, but I can't really speak it.
The majority of Singapore's population are Chinese, and Mandarin was assigned to them by the state as their mother tongue. However, Chinese Singaporeans use English, not Mandarin, almost exclusively in all domains today, and for good reason. Remember that 2010 study? It was done on 907 Chinese Singaporean parents and found that the higher a family's SES, the more likely English is spoken at home. For instance, it is found that more English-speaking families lived in the more expensive homes than Chinese-speaking ones, while the lower-end houses had more Chinese-speaking families than English-speaking ones. In other words, English has prestige, while Chinese is associated with poverty and stigma, due to the high correlation of Chinese-speaking families and low SES. To speak Mandarin is to associate oneself with a community with less power economically, socially, and politically, and adopting a stigmatized language over a prestigious one. Similarly, for the Malay community, there is an increasing shift to English. Although their retention of Malay is the highest among the other races, there are still strong signs of a language shift away to English. As English offers more opportunities for upward social mobility, Malay parents use English at home to expose their child to the most valuable societal language. Malay as a home language dropped from 2010 to 2015.
In the Consensus of Population 2010's 200,000 households surveyed, 47% of Malays with a university degree used English as a home language compared to only 4.4% of Malays with below secondary school qualifications. This indicates there is a correlation between the use of English versus Malay and SES in terms of the level of education. The number of Malay households using English has increased from 1 in 5 Malay households 20 years ago to 2 out of 3 Malay households in 2019, according to data from the Ministry of Education.
Within the Tamil-speaking community, there is also a language shift to English as over the generations, the English-Tamil bilingual Singaporeans have started identifying themselves with English. One study on 101 Tamil speakers aged 18 to 25 found that its Tamil-dominant participants have lower household income compared to their English-dominant counterparts. The study concluded that more Tamil-dominated participants hailed from low and middle-class income households, while more of the English-dominant participants were from the high-income groups. Identifying with the Tamil-dominant groups implies that one belongs to a smaller community that has less power economically, politically, and socially. In the cases of language shift within all three ethnic groups, English is the dominant language because of its association with either speakers who boast a high SES or the promise of rising in SES. What happens when another language gains prestige due to the rise in SES of its speakers? China's rise to become a global superpower is undeniable. In fact, it is expected to surpass the English-speaking US by 2032 to become the world's top economy. Mandarin already has the most native speakers at more than 1.3 billion. One 2011 paper suggests that Chinese language teaching may then begin earlier and be allocated more resources, similar to how countries begin teaching English during the early years of schooling and devote significant resources to it. Chinese will then see an increase in its scope and presence as a priority foreign language around the world. But that is still an open question.